Hi, dude. Should I start?
So you can start.
Hi, guys. Welcome to this lecture series on current affairs that we do for Project Maverick. Am I audible properly? Is my voice fine? Anyway, it should be fine. So we've been going month-wise. In the last 3, 4 videos, what we discussed was primarily current affairs that I believe are important for your CLAT exam, primarily from the month of October. So in today's video, what I will be looking at is current affairs from the month of November. So we'll also, just like the other month, we'll probably take about 2.5 to 3 hours, basically 3 to 4 classes to cover whatever important happened in November. Now, in today's video, we'll primarily be looking at everything and anything that happened in terms of international affairs. So while November is important because a lot of international summits happened over November virtually, right? And therefore, though the current affairs bit is very small vis-a-vis what exactly happened in this sort of summit, what's happened in this virtual meeting, etc. But what is important is that could be asked a lot of static questions from you, right? Let's say there's an Indian ASEAN summit. Then apart from knowing what was the outcome of the summit, you should generally know what ASEAN is, what is the history of India and ASEAN links, etc. So to cover all of that, we'll try going through this video in detail. Um, yeah. So the first thing that I want to discuss is the regional comprehensive economic partnership. So if you've been following the news, this was probably the biggest news in the month of November. So towards the end of November, about 15 nations of the Asia Pacific, they signed the RCEP. Now, it was expected that India would also somehow end up signing this RCEP, but towards the end, there were certain issues and there were certain thorns in terms of the sort of negotiations that happened between all of these nations. And there were some issues that India could not go ahead with. I mean, there were issues that India could not ignore, and it couldn't go ahead with the RCEP as long as these issues persist. So let's try to look at what the issues were. But before that, just look at what the RCEP is, because RCEP is something which has the potential to define the next 50 to 60 years of global development and growth. Okay. So let's look at what RCEP is. So RCEP is basically a fancy name for a comprehensive trade agreement that has been signed between 15 countries. So those are 10 of them are your standard ASEAN members. In the next couple of slides, we'll not probably, we'll definitely look at who the ASEAN members are. Apart from the ASEAN members, you have China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. So all of these countries ended up signing. Potentially, it could have been 16 countries, but India backed out towards the end. Now, irrespective of India being a part of the RCEP, the RCEP forms the largest trade bloc in the world. Okay, the current population of RCB, and remember this is excluding India, is about 2.2 billion people. And in terms of economic share, the 30% of the world's economy pertains to these 15 countries. Now, it's not that RCEP is a recent phenomenon. Obviously, something of such a large magnitude will not happen in a couple of years. The first idea of RCEP was proposed in the 19th ASEAN meeting in 2011. So the aim so the aim basically was that anyways the ASEAN countries have great cooperation between each other, and they felt that they should extend this cooperation vis-a-vis their trading partners, and they should somehow include those trading partners in a larger regional bloc, right? So after the 19th ASEAN meet, these countries tried to reach out to the other regional partners, your South Korea, China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and all of them are massive economies in their own right. Right. So obviously, from 2011 onwards, India was a very important part of the RCEP negotiations. However, in 2019, it dropped out, saying that there are certain issues outside the RCEP which remain unresolved. Okay, and India, obviously, because see, India has huge economic heft, right? We probably end up being a 5 trillion economy if everything goes well. We have a huge market. There's 1.3 billion people in India. We are also now a good destination for export, etc., in terms of the fact that our manufacturing capacity has evolved. We are a great service provider, and our input in terms of the service sector is phenomenal, right? So obviously these countries want India to be a part of it. However, because these negotiations could not be continued, India said, okay, I will join it later. But and then these countries also agreed that if you are able to, through negotiations, or if better sense prevails in either of these blocks, they will allow India to join later. Okay. Now let's look at what these RCEP countries are. So all these countries that are marked in blue here, obviously, are your ASEAN countries. Now, outside of these ASEAN countries, you have China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. Right. So it's a fair enough. So it's a reasonably regional, not reasonably, it's a regional block of sorts, right? It's geographically very concentrated. Okay. Now let's understand why it's out, right? This would generally help you in understanding India's global trade position and India's policy on international trade. Because obviously, if something is affecting the RCEP and India is pulling out of free trade agreements, this is not going to be the only free trade agreement with which India will have issues. There are a lot of free trade agreements with, let's say, the UK post Brexit, a lot of other countries which are in the pipeline. Now, the sort of issues that India faced with RCEP countries and the sort of issues that it could potentially face arising out of a free trade agreement with these would apply to any and all other free trade agreements. Okay. Now, a thorough study was conducted, and if you look at the numbers, these numbers are not really in India's favor. So, as of now, even without any sort of a free trade agreement where India is able to enact protectionist policies and protect its own industry and promote its own industries, there is a huge deficit that India has with the RCEP countries. So, as of 2013-14, our deficit with the RCEP countries was about $54 billion, right? A deficit basically means we are exporting X amount of goods, they are exporting Y amount of goods to us, and Y minus X in their favor is $54 billion. Now, over the last 4-5 years, this deficit doubled to approximately $105 billion, and out of which China alone accounts for $53 billion. So one of the bigger issues that we have with RCEP countries is that China is going to be a huge trading partner. And if we are giving very, very favorable terms to any of the RCEP partners, those favorable terms would automatically extend to China. And that is not something that India really wants, because as it is, our trade imbalance with China is highly skewed in their favor. Okay. Now, apart from these numbers and apart from the trade imbalance that lies in favor of RCEP, there are certain geopolitical considerations also. And if you've not been living under a rock, you would understand that India and China have certain issues which go beyond trade, right? There are regional security issues. There are issues pertaining to free movement in the Asia Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific region, etc. So all of that do exist. Now, apart from that, because India wants to protect its own economy from cheap and cheap goods from China, and China allegedly helps out its industry in a lot of ways that is not permitted under the World Trade Organization, and it's sort of against the principles of free trade. Okay, so if India enters the RCEP, it will have to give a most favored nation obligation to China. And that's not something that it wants to do, especially with the fact that there are multiple border disputes with China. And sort of giving China an MFN status in for the investment chapter would not align very well with India's geopolitical reason, strategic position, right? So MFN, most favored nation clause, is very simple. Let's say I, as a country, have an agreement with any other country, and I give them favorable trades. Now, these favorable trades could be different from the sort of agreement I probably entered 10 years ago or 15 years ago with some other country, based on the circumstances behind those negotiations that existed then. Now, every time I grant certain exemptions to a new country, I don't have to go back and revise my prior agreements. In those prior agreements, there would probably be a clause which would be treated as the most favorable nation clause, which effectively means that any and all favors or anything extra that you're doing with some other country at a later date or a later point of time, those sort of benefits would automatically extend to the company or to the country that you've entered into an agreement with already in the past. Okay. Now, apart from this, there are obviously security considerations, right? And as it is, India is reeling heavily from economic coercion by China, and not just India, but other countries in the region. And India believes that entering into the RCEP would probably not be conducive to the political and economic interest of both India and these other countries, especially with the sort of aggressive international policy that China has been following since President Xi Jinping has ascended to the position of leader, president of that country, of China, right? Now, apart from that, India also has another issue, and this is a slightly technical issue. India says that India wants there to be proper labeling, and India wants to have very strict rules of origin, right? Rules of origin basically means the sort of rules and criteria will help to which help to determine the actual source or actual site of production on those particular goods, right? Now, obviously, there are multiple different tariff policies vis-a-vis other countries, right? So China and India were sort of, let's say, so one of the exceptions that China had given to India was that if you join the RCEP, we will let our bilateral, as in we will negotiate our bilateral issues inside the RCEP a little separately. Let all the other principles of the RCEP apply to your trade relations with other ASEAN countries. Now, the problem here with India is that China has been doing it, and it can potentially route all of its manufactured products through any other country. So we don't want to obviously give any sort of benefits to China, but it can surreptitiously gain those benefits by routing those investments through those exports through other countries. Now, to prevent that, India said that, okay, we are okay with this sort of conditional deal with China, provided there are stringent rules of origin requirements that are adhered to and accepted by the RCEP countries. Now, this hasn't been accepted in the RCEP. Further, India said that there should be an auto trigger mechanism. Let's say there is some country whose exports are increasing exponentially to India, and beyond a certain threshold, India would not want those many exports from that particular country. So there should be an auto trigger mechanism whereby if the imports, from any other country exceed a certain threshold, then after that you can impose tariffs. Now, obviously, this also wasn't accepted by the RCEP countries. So, India didn't want to lose flexibility vis-a-vis tariffs, and it wanted strong measures against circumvention of rule of origin. That didn't happen, and therefore India said that if those things cannot happen, then we will probably not be able to protect our industries or domestic industries uh, from products that are going to flood the Indian market from regimes that have basically subsidized production. And when these subsidized production happens because of unfair advantages that are given by these countries. So basically, this aim and target of this statement was against China. So that is the primary reason why India says that we cannot afford to be a part of the RCEP. Okay. Now, there are a few other things as well. Now, if India is entering into the RCEP, now India's manufacturing capacity is not that strong, but what we excel is in services, right? So service sector also contributes to a large part of our GDP. So now India said very simply that if you want manufacturing to be a part of this regional comprehensive economic partnership, let's also open up and let's also talk about the service component in this RCEP. Now, obviously, all the other countries have an effective trade deficit balance with India, and they don't want to open up their own markets to Indian companies and Indian service providers. So these countries couldn't agree to this, and because these countries don't want to give further advantage to an industry in which India is already a leader, India was also not ready to accept the RCEP. Now, apart from that, if the RCEP would have happened and you would have had subsidized sort of imports from China, then a lot of domestic industries like your agriculture, dairy, because Australia and New Zealand would then send a lot of meat and milk to India. And then you have copper, aluminium, machine tools, etc. All of these all of these multiple sectors could have been threatened, and there was a lot of pressure from your internal and domestic industrial, let's say, not lobbies, but industrial groups, etc., pressure groups, etc. Okay. Now, these are all the numbers that are pertaining to the RCEP. Now, there is also another study that was conducted by the Niti Aayog, and it studied all of India's free trade agreements that India has entered into the past. So the Niti Aayog said that India has not really benefited from any of these FTAs that it has entered into. Okay. And basically, imports technically, so the benefit of an FTA for India would be that if its exports to the other countries increase, right? So if it gains in its net trade balance, only then would those FTAs be profitable to India. But to the contrary, the reverse has happened. Whichever country that we have entered into an FTA with has in some way or the other gained an advantage, and our imports and the share of imports has increased post the FTAs. Okay, so for example, we have FTAs with South Korea, we have FTAs with Japan, and we also have existing FTAs with ASEAN. So all of these FTAs have shifted the trade balance in favor of these countries. Okay, now, so apart from that, in terms of trade, tariffs are not the only barriers that countries can impose, right? There could be other barriers that countries would impose. You could have technical barriers, you could have phytosanitary barriers. Now, this agreement is fairly silent on these sort of non-tariff measures and non-tariff barriers to trade. And India wanted a sterner on a better commitment and a more, let's say, and a better assurance from these countries, which was not given to India. And therefore, that's also one of the reasons that India said, okay, there's no point then of entering into this RCEP. Now, apart from this, if you look at the sort of other countries apart from China that are part of the RCEP, so India already has bilateral FTAs with ASEAN, Korea, and Japan, and we are also negotiating individually with Australia and New Zealand. So if you eliminate China from this grouping, in the near future, we will anyways have free trade agreements with all the other countries individually. So India and Indian government did not see much interest, or it did not see much point to entering into the RCEP. It effectively would mean entering into an FTA with China, which is something that India doesn't want. Okay. Now, obviously, there would be certain impacts of India not joining the RCEP. Okay, the primary would be that it would send a message to the world that India is turning protectionist. Now, this is also coinciding with the time that we're talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat. Now, the idea, obviously, of Atmanirbhar Bharat is not that India will only produce for itself. The idea is that India will be self-reliant and India will produce for the world. And Atmanirbhar Bharat, according to the government itself, is not going against the principles of free trade. However, when these two things are looked at in conjunction, there is a possibility that other countries and investors in other countries would perceive India as a protectionist regime, and that would not bode well for further growth of trade to and from India. Okay, then obviously it can have an impact on India's export sector. Once the RCEP is finalized between these countries, trade between those countries becomes a little more free and there are lesser barriers, etc. Now, because India will not be a part of this RCEP, those countries could trade on better and competitive terms with each other as opposed to India. And therefore, India's export sector could lose out a large chunk of trade with those countries. Now, RCP, so earlier, like if you can say that with the advent of COVID, we are entering into this new epoch or a new era. So probably 100, 200 years down the line, we'd be looking at this period as pre-COVID era and post-COVID era. Now, there was a possibility that RCEP, because it is the biggest trade bloc on the planet right now, it could emerge as the center of economic growth and development for the next era. And if India is not a part of this RCEP, there is a potential that India might not be a part of this new world order that will develop post the COVID era. Okay, and then obviously, further there would be an effect on bilateral ties with the RCEP countries. The RCEP countries would say that we anyways wanted you to join the RCEP. If you're not joining the RCEP, we don't really need you that much, and they might not be able to, and they might not be willing to give sort of concessions that India would want in terms of their bilateral trade agreements. Okay. So this is pretty much it that you should know about the RCEP. What is the RCEP? What are the countries involved? Why India pulled out? Pretty much that. Okay. Now the next thing, one second. Okay. The next thing we should be looking at is the 17th ASEAN India Summit. Now, independently, also it is important that ASEAN and India have had the summit, but then you could have a question from ASEAN pertaining to your RCEP. You could have a question for ASEAN pertaining to ASEAN itself, or you could have a question pertaining to what happened in the 17th India ASEAN Summit. Okay, so this summit, obviously, in the COVID era, was also held virtually. So let's first look at what exactly is this ASEAN. So ASEAN stands for Association of Southeast Asian Nations. One thing I will block here. Oh, great. Cool. So there are 10 countries in ASEAN. These are the 10 countries that you have. You have Myanmar, you have Thailand, Cambodia, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Laos, Philippines, and Brunei. Please try to remember these countries. This could very well be a question, that which of these following countries is a member of the ASEAN. Okay. Now, the idea behind ASEAN is to promote some sort of intergovernmental corporate cooperation and to facilitate all sorts of economic, political, security, military, educational, and even socio-cultural integration amongst these member countries. And as a bloc, these member countries would then interact on these parameters with other countries. Okay. So the ASEAN is fairly old. It was established in 1967, and this was established by signing this declaration, which is now known as the Bangkok Declaration. So the founding fathers of ASEAN now is a 10-membered organization, but ASEAN was founded by these 5 countries: Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand. Okay. Now, the ASEAN Secretariat or the main office is in Jakarta, Indonesia. Okay. Now, obviously, since we're going to talk about India ASEAN Summit, the 17th India ASEAN Summit, let's look at the relationship that India has shared with ASEAN over the years. Okay. So in 2002, in the ASEAN India Commemorative Summit, ASEAN India Summits were and then they were something that became a little more permanent. And since 2002, we've always had India ASEAN summits. Okay. Now, India's status as a status vis-a-vis ASEAN was upgraded to that of a strategic partner in 2012. It had become, let's say, a sectoral partner in 1992 already, a dialogue partner in 1996, and a summit level partner in 2002. So from 2012, India has become a very important, let's say, sort of a partner of ASEAN countries, and now it has the status of a strategic partner. Okay. Now, with the advent of the Narendra Modi government, you have heard that now India earlier on used to have a look east policy, in the sense that India would want to apprise itself of what is happening in the east. Now, with the advent of this government, they have tweaked this policy a little, and they believe that a lot of economic development and a lot of security challenges that India faces could be, let's say, sort of addressed better if India actually starts developing its eastern region and starts processes to integrate with and sort of have more of, let's say, a coordination, so integrate with and have more coordination with the countries towards its east. Now, this policy of this government is known as the Act East policy, and this was formally announced vis-a-vis ASEAN in the 12th summit in 2014, right and ripe when the new government came in. Okay. So as I pointed out earlier, these are your ASEAN member countries. Now let's look at what were the key highlights of this summit. So the first thing is that India said, okay, we will donate $101 million to the COVID-19 ASEAN Response Fund. So just like our PM Cares Fund, they have a separate fund for fighting COVID in their respective countries. So India has donated $1 million to that. Okay. Now, they have now also adopted this new plan known as the ASEAN India Plan of Action for 21 to 25. It's effectively like a 5-year plan. Excuse me, sir, is it necessary to write the points that you're sharing on the screen? No, please don't write it down. What I will do is I will send all of these slides that I prepared, this slide and the other slides, to Pratikesh, and then Pratikesh will share them with you. So don't waste your time making notes out of this. Just listen carefully and try to understand. These notes I will send across to you. Okay. Cool. So anyway, so now India and ASEAN have a new 5-year plan, and this plan basically focuses on important things like political cooperation, maritime cooperation, climate change, tourism, science, transport, agriculture, etc. So you name it, everything is basically being covered. And now there is a 5-year time limit, in the sense that there is a structured plan for the next 5 years. Okay. Now, India has also said that we will extend a $1 billion line of credit. So line of credit is basically like a very low interest loan that India would give to ASEAN countries and ASEAN businesses, provided that money is used for promoting greater physical and digital connectivity between ASEAN and India, right? So if there's a company, either a government company or a private company in let's say in any of these ASEAN countries, and it wants to develop physical and digital links with India, and obviously it needs money for that. Now, if it raises money from the market, they would probably charge a higher rate of interest, and that would make the project more expensive for these countries. So India has said that if you want to partake in any such project, we will give you a $1 billion line of credit at a very subsidized and low interest rate. So that would make these ventures very profitable for these entities. Okay. Now, apart from that, India and ASEAN already have an FTA. Now, in light of the fact that India has withdrawn from the RCEP, India has said that that's now the FTA that we entered with each other is now a very old FTA. The realities on the ground have changed a little. Let's try to renegotiate the new FTA in such a way that it is mutually beneficial to both the countries. So obviously there are certain issues that ASEAN countries have with the older FTA. There are certain issues that India has with the older FTA, and they want to sort of meet up, negotiate, and effectively renegotiate a new and a better FTA. Okay. Okay, so the next thing that happened was that there was this 2020 BRICS Summit, which was obviously also conducted virtually, and the chairmanship was with the president of Russia. Okay, so here again, current affair is very limited, but you should then know what exactly is the BRICS and what are the founding principles behind BRICS, and the sort of things that BRICS does. Okay, so first of all, there is no official organization known as the BRICS. It doesn't have an office or anything. So effectively, there was an article published in Goldman Sachs for Brazil. Okay, in Goldman Sachs, and one of the people in those articles, he coined this term known as the BRIC. BRIC at that point of time stood for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. South Africa was added much later in 2010. Okay, so the idea behind coining these terms BRIC was that this economist who worked for Goldman Sachs believed that if all of, so that believe that the growth trend across the world is such that these economies, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and South Africa later on, will be the major drivers of growth post 2050, right? 2050, these new emerging economies and their economic heft will eclipse those of the established old economies like Britain, US, Japan, etc. Okay. Now, as I said, there is no official organization. It only exists in the form of annual summits. So every year, leaders of these nations meet. They probably have a discussion about the sort of future engagements that they want to have with each other and the sort of collective negotiation, if you may say, that they want to have with other countries. Okay. So the first BRICS summit obviously took place in 2009 in Russia. Okay. Now, the chairmanship of the BRICS forum is rotated annually amongst its members based on in accordance with the BRICS acronym. Okay. Now, the idea behind BRICS, the official idea, is to deepen, broaden, and intensify cooperation within the grouping and amongst individual countries for sustainable, equitable, and mutually beneficial development. So, the ambit of what sort of discussions you can have within the BRICS is very wide, and that is the reason why there are annual, let's say, programs over 100 sectors within these economies. Okay. Now, if you want to look at the the heft of BRICS, basically BRICS is 50% of global growth, 42.5% of global population, 1/4 of the global land area, almost 1/4 of the global GDP, 16% of IMF quota shares. I will try to explain to you IMF quota shares in probably some other video, not this, it's a slightly bigger topic. And then it also represents about 13.5% of the voting power with the World Bank. Okay. Now let's look at what were the key declarations of this particular summit. Okay. Cool. So the declaration, as in towards the end of the summit, there are obviously joint declarations by everyone who participates in that summit. Now, this declaration, which came out of this BRICS summit, is known as the Moscow Declaration. Okay. Now, in this Moscow Declaration, they primarily talked about two things. The first is obviously and foremost the economy, and the second thing was counterterrorism, right? Because with the growth of extremism in the world, and if you look at the United States trying to exit Afghanistan and there being a political vacuum, and there is an apprehension that it might lead to emergence of radical Islamist groups. Russia, China, and India have very similar interest in that they don't want proliferation and migration of Islamic extremist groups from Afghanistan or neighboring countries into their respective countries, right? So counterterrorism was also something that was discussed in great detail. Now, okay. So BRICS, obviously the world is emerging from the coronavirus pandemic. So BRICS countries decided that we should have some sort of an early warning system, and it should be operated on scientific principles. And because there should be, let's say, as in, and this sort of your early warning system should be such that your countries could then be better prepared for the pandemics, right? For example, let's say coronavirus outbreak happened in Russia, sorry, in China, right? And if the world had been a little more serious, if we had a credible early warning system, we probably, the sort of impact that coronavirus had, and it is still having and raging across the world, that could have been mitigated. An example would be that there was an outbreak of the Nipah virus in Kerala in India, right? So that, similar to COVID, was a zoonotic virus, but India tackled that virus really well. They managed to lock it down all inside Kerala, and that didn't become a global catastrophe, right? So if these countries could have some sort of a mechanism like that, and if they could have an early warning, a credible early warning system, then probably something in the nature of COVID and the sort of impacts that it had globally could be prevented, right? Now, these countries obviously got together, and they also talked about the fact that the global governance model, which runs through organizations like UN Security Council, IMF, WTO, etc., these have to be overhauled, because these countries genuinely believe that the sort of mechanisms that exist in these international bodies are mechanisms that are somehow tweaked and are in favor of the Western nations. Okay. Now, obviously, in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, these organizations also criticized the World Health Organization. These countries also called for reforms in the World Health Organization. Now, the role of the World Health Organization has been in the news, and let's say it's not done a very good job vis-a-vis the coronavirus pandemic. Okay. Now, another thing that is fairly important if you are looking at BRICS is the creation of the New Development Bank. Okay, so New Development Bank is was created in the sixth summit in Fortaleza, Brazil, and the declaration which led to the creation of the New Development Bank is known as the Fortaleza Declaration. So the headquarters of the New Development Bank are in Shanghai. Okay. Now, New Development Bank sort of operates like other lending institutions like World Bank, etc., and it gives money to the sort of country to the countries that require investment for development, etc. Now, as of today, there are 62 large projects globally that are being funded by the New Development Bank. And because the New Development Bank does not want itself to be restricted to only the BRICS countries, it has it is now preparing to accept new members like Uruguay, UAE, and the Philippines, and thereby expanding its global footprint. Now, one of the good things about the New Development Bank is that the other lending institutions like your IMF and the World Bank, they obviously also give loans, and their ability to give loans and the corpus is much bigger, but they give conditional loans. For example, India took a loan from the IMF in 1991 to get out of it, balance a payment crisis. But the condition that the IMF imposed on that loan was that India would have to open up its economy and India would have to liberalize. So when the New Development Bank lends money or gives loans at concessional rates, it effectively gives a conditional free loan. It effectively gives non-conditional financing, and there is nothing apart from the interest payment and the principal payment that has to come from the borrower. There are no conditions imposed on these borrowers. Now, obviously, as of now, the New Development Bank is not as big as your Bretton Woods institutions, which are the World Bank and the IMF. But maybe over the years, as these countries prosper, they could put in more money and more liquidity with these banks. Now, NDB is very important for India. India was a foundational member, and it was the main country behind BRICS to establish this NDB. And obviously, India is the biggest beneficiary of the New Development Bank. So the most number of projects that are being funded by New Development Bank, both in terms of numbers and both in terms of volume, absolute volume, are in India. Okay. So that's pretty much it that you do know BRICS and the New Development Bank, etc. Now, the next thing that I want to discuss with you is the 15th G20 Summit. Okay. Now, our PM participated in this summit that was hosted by Saudi Arabia, obviously in a virtual format. Now, before we talk about what exactly happened in the G20 summit, let's try to understand what are these G20 countries. So G20 countries is nothing. Basically, it's a group of the 20 major economies of the world. Now, they account for about 80% of the global GDP and 75% of global trade. And on top of that, it's 60% of the global population. Okay. So since 1999, the G20 summit has become an annual event. Now, similar to India, it doesn't have a secretariat, it doesn't have a permanent office. Okay. And the chairmanship lies with the country, with the chairmanship or the presidentship keeps on rotating with these countries, right? So in your whenever there's a G20 summit, there's a troika, which means that there are three countries that sort of manage the agenda for that particular meeting. These are countries that have already hosted the G20 summit, the country that is hosting the G20 summit, and the third country is the country which is going to host the next G20 summit. So this troika sort of ensures that there's a continuity in the agenda that is put forward for discussion in the G20. Okay. Now the primary aim obviously is to look for global economics stability and sort of and to promote growth, but that growth should ideally be some form of a sustainable growth. And obviously it would make sure the G20 ensures that all the global economies align their policies as such, so that you can prevent a major financial crisis from challenging the world again. Okay. Now these are your G20 countries. Please pause the screen if you want. Otherwise, I'm going to anyway share these slides with you. So just have a look at these G20 countries. Okay. Okay. Now that we know what G20 is, now that we know which are the member countries of the G20, now that we know it's basically an economic, so the primary discussions are along economic lines, let's look at the sort of relationship that India has with the G20. So the important fact that you should know is that India not added later on to the G20. India is a foundational member of the G20. Now within the G20, India has made some important, let's say, proposals. For example, on terrorism, it has come up with a proposal. Then it has come up with the idea of economic offenders. If you've been following international in Indian domestic policy, we've come up with a fugitive offenders bill, right? Fugitive offender act, in the sense, so which allows your enforcement directorate, etc., to attach properties of the people that have basically not repaid loans and they've just run away from this country. So what India has done domestically, India is also now trying to push globally, so that there is a global sort of an arrangement and some sort of a mechanism to make sure that people do not escape countries wherein they have huge debt liabilities and seek safe haven in other countries. Now, India also suggested that global taxation is going to be an issue, because nowadays the character and the nature of multinational companies is that they have offices and multiple offices in different countries, and they strategically place these offices to ensure that there is minimum taxation. Now this process is known as base erosion and profit shifting. Now, because of the efforts that India has made within the G20 and the sort of inputs that India has given, now the G20 has come up with this framework known as the BEPS, or the base erosion profit sharing framework. Okay. And India obviously has been talking about digital India domestically, and it is trying to promote a greater digital integration across the major economies of the world. Okay. Now, with greater digital interaction and with greater reliance on digital trade, etc., there are bound to be certain issues that crop up vis-a-vis your digital technology. Issues like privacy, data security, data localization, etc. And India has been pushing forward this agenda in the G20 as well. Okay. So another meeting that happened virtually was of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So before we look at what exactly was discussed in this meeting, let's look at what the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is. Okay. So this one, unlike the others, is a permanent intergovernmental political, economic, and military organization. So unlike your G20 or BRICS, which is not an organization, the SCO is a legit proper organization with its headquarters being in Shanghai, China, obviously. Now it was set up in 2001. So since it's a proper organization, it has a fixed agenda, development, obviously, and security issues. Okay. Terrorism, ethnic separatism, religious extremism, all of those are basic security issues that SCO looks at sort of handling and looks at forming opinions and deliberating on. Okay. So if you look at the SEO, English is not a working language. There are currently two official and working languages, Mandarin and Russian. So that's something, that's a fact that you should remember. Now, the working of the SEO is basically, the SEO works on this principle of the Shanghai spirit, which basically means that all countries are equal and we should respect the sovereign matters of each country, and we should consider each country to be equal, and their only discussion and deliberation should not be under any sort of pressure tactics, and these should be based on mutual respect. Okay. Now, there is a dual working structure for the SEO. In the next slide, it will become very clear to you why I'm talking about this dual structure. The first is the head of state council. This is the highest decision making body in the SEO. The next one is the head of government council. This is the second highest body. Now, why I'm making this distinction is very simple. Okay. So, at the beginning, the summit of the SEO Council of Heads of State was presided over by the Russian president. But at the same time, the 19th meeting of the SEO Council of the Heads of Government, which is the second highest decision-making body, was presided over by India's Vice President, Mr. Naidu. Okay. So therefore, the fact that this has two working mechanisms becomes a little important. Now, the SEO has two bodies. The first one is your secretariat, obviously, that is in Shanghai. And the second body is the regional anti-terrorism structure called RATS. Now, from the name also, it is very clear that the idea of RAT is to combat global and regional terrorism. Now, the headquarters for RATS are in Mongolia. Okay. I forgot to write it here. Just keep that in mind. Now, SEO also has a business council, etc. If you look at the heft of the SEO, it represents about 40% of the global population and only 20% of the global GDP. So economically, it's not that big of an organization. But if you look at it in terms of population, it's a fairly big organization. Okay. So if you look at the members of the SEO in terms of military might, four of these countries, India, Russia, China, and Pakistan, are nuclear power states. And two of them, Russia and China, are permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Now, obviously, India also wants to get a permanent seat at the Security Council. There are multiple issues vis-a-vis that. There are certain countries that oppose it. And that's something, sort of a discussion that we probably reserve for another day. Okay. So in terms of your strategic and military terms, some people say that SEO potentially is sort of a counterweight to the NATO. Okay. Now that assertion, I think, is a little problematic because of the rivalry that has emerged between India and China and between India and Pakistan. Is highly unlikely that this will ever develop into some sort of a military alliance that the NATO is, right? Because the interests are very differently aligned. Okay. So these are the SEO countries: Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, India, and China. So basically India, China, Russia, and the Central Asian countries. Okay. Now, this is the first SEO summit. So we are living in different special times. So this time the summit was held in a virtual format. Okay. And India said that in 2021, the National Museum of India, to celebrate this, because cultural integration and respect for each other's cultures is also one of the pillars of the Shanghai, one of the ideas of the Shanghai spirit, right? So India has said that the National Museum of India will soon hold an exhibition on the Buddhist heritage, which connects all of these SEO countries. Okay. And India also said that we'll set up a special working group on innovation, startups, and a subgroup on traditional medicine within the SEO, right? So if you look at the countries that are part of the SEO, you have India and China. Both of us are civilizational states. We are not some 100-year, 200-year-old country like the US, right? We've been in existence for thousands of years, and therefore we have very rich traditions. And your medicine is also, and traditional medicine is also part of those rich cultural heritage that we have. And therefore, India has said that we should set up a special group to focus on your traditional medicine, and then coming to a more modern theme, we should look at special working group for innovation and startups, because a lot of problems that these countries face would require some great innovation, and startups are potentially the sort of organizations, and with the sort of alignment, with the sort of non-profit seeking mindset that they have, these are the organizations that could probably solve the issues that pertain to these the economies and the countries of the SEO. Okay. Now, as I said, the SCO meeting of heads of government was presided by the Russian president, and the Indian vice president chaired the meeting of the SCO Council of Heads. Okay. So India became a full-time member of the SCO only in 2017, and it's been only 3-4 years. And this is the first time that India got a chance to be a chairman of the meeting. So the point of being a chairman is that once you're a chairman of this meeting, you can set the agenda, you can set the topic for discussion, and therefore you can drive the point. You can drive the discussion around. And if you believe there are certain important things that need to be discussed, and if your country gets the presidency, then obviously those points are going to be the most important points being discussed in that in those meetings, etc. Okay. Now SEO also talked about things that were already talked about in the BRICS vis-a-vis reforming WTO, etc. Another very interesting thing was, though all the countries in the SCO support and are a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, China, India has said no, we do not agree with it. So the primary reason that India is not okay with the Belt and Road Initiative, apart from the geopolitical and the geopolitical and strategic implication that it can have, is that one of the components of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the CPEC, runs through Pakistani occupied Kashmir. Now, China and Pakistan have entered into agreements to develop the CPEC, which is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Now, technically speaking, Pakistan's occupation of Kashmir or that part of Kashmir is illegal under international law, and India firmly holds that. Now, because India says that territory is formally India's territory, and Pakistan has wrongfully seized that territory. Therefore, China shouldn't have gone ahead with the CPC through a disputed territory, and even if it had to, it should have considered India. And China didn't do this, so India generally is not amenable to the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative. Okay. So, guys, this is pretty much all that I had to discuss with you today. Thank you for listening. I will give these slides to Hrithikesh, and then he can distribute it to the Maverick group. Okay, thanks.